Okay. All right. Good. Well, let's begin, Karl, with some of your story, because that's, you know, when I have people on my channel, I always want your points to be in context of your story. And you've told your story, a number of different times. You've told it on Karen Wong's channel, and maybe a little bit of your background, and why don't you start, and then we'll get to your really interesting stuff.
All right.
In due time. Don't worry.
Yeah, real quick. Yes, yeah, I've talked on Karen's channel, but you have a lot more viewers, so I don't mind saying it again. It's kind of interesting because I grew up in France, so in Europe, and actually the country I've lived the longest in my life is Germany, and that's mostly because I was in the Air Force and I was stationed in Germany a long time, both when I was on active duty in the Air Force, and then I stayed in Germany as a civilian contractor working for the Air Force for quite a long time after I retired from the Air Force. Eventually, I moved here to Orlando, Florida for work reasons. I had no connections to Florida, you know, with no family or anything, but it was just work related. I got a position here, and that's where I ended up for the last 7 years now. But we moved to Orlando from Germany. So I have a wife and 3 little children, even though I'm not very young. I'm older than you, but I have 3 relatively young children, you know, 9, 8, or soon to be 10 years old, 8 years old, and a 5-year-old. And also it keeps me very busy.
Well, you're also staying in good shape if you're running that triathlon.
Yeah, I ran this morning. But yeah, I do. I used to do full Ironman distance, which is like really long. I mean, it would take me like 11 and a half hours to complete. You know, it's like very, very long. But no, I still do half Ironman. I did one in December in Daytona, and it's still good fun.
So did you grow up in a religious household or not?
Yeah, I was going to bring that up. So that's also interesting. Not a very religious household, but I was exposed to a religious idea. On my mother's side, I'm Catholic. You know, my mother is the French side of the family. My dad is originally from Estonia, but they moved out of Estonia during World War II when the Russians, there was back and forth between the Russians and the Germans. And he actually lived in a refugee camp in Germany for 7 years before immigrated to the United States.
Really?
But on my mother's side, French family, the Catholic, you know, France traditionally has been more a Catholic country. Although, you know, way back there were wars of religion between the Protestants then and whatnot. The St. Bartholomew massacre was something that we were taught in school and things like that. And on my father's side, I'm a Lutheran, and actually formally my formal, you know, I haven't had too much formal religious education, but I did go through the Lutheran confirmation process when I was about 19 years old. So I was in college, and in San Francisco, as a matter of fact.
Really?
And we had a Lutheran pastor who was also from Estonia, and I did go through the full confirmation, you know, process in the Lutheran Church. And I've attended services of various denominations. Here in Orlando, most of the time, we don't go to church regularly, perhaps for obvious reasons. You know enough of what I've said before about my doubts and well, I'm sure we'll get into it a lot more. But
why did you go through confirmation?
Confirmation is like communion.
No, I know, but why did you do it?
Well, my dad wanted me to, and I mean, I'm a very curious person by nature. I do not reject learning about things offhand very easily. I'm willing to try. You know, it turns out it really is not my thing, but I still gain something out of it. I mean, it's you know, and that's why I definitely am not anti-religious, as you know. I actually. It bothers me, you know, people like Sam Harris and the new atheists, which you've been, you know, combating on YouTube. I'm on your side on this one, completely. You know, I'm not in agreement with you on quite a few things. We can talk about those, but in general, though, it's interesting that I've always felt closer to religious people than to atheists. Even though I myself consider myself an agnostic, I don't like using the word atheist to describe myself, because that denotes a certainty of knowledge that's just not there. It's agnostic much better reflects my state of mind. You know, I just don't know. It's possible there is more to it than what we see. The evidence I see tends to say no, there is not, but I'm not dismissing it out of hand.
So what were you?
Points you make? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, what were you doing? So you were 19. You did Lutheran confirmation. Were you in school at that point?
Yeah, I was at UC Berkeley. I was in college. You know, studying engineering physics. So my background, my academic background, was in the hard sciences.
Okay.
And that influences my thinking quite a bit. But I do have some not issues, but we can discuss your views on science and how I have slightly different views on this. I think part of it is because most people associate, when they hear the word science, they automatically think of physics or something like that, like Newtonian, right. Einstein, you know, maybe chemistry and maybe biology even, but to them, that's what science is. To me, I think it's a lot broader than that. And we can talk about this later. But
so how did you get into the Air Force?
Well, let me finish something on the religion. Like
okay.
My children, you know, I taught my 3 children, and I don't know if this was recorded. So I have 3 children. One is about to turn, my daughter, about to turn 10 years old in March. My son just turned 8, and my little daughter is 5. And they've gone to church, you know, and we've been invited by friends who are religious to go. And again, I don't mind. You know, I'm definitely not militating against them being exposed. And I don't want them to become atheist. I also don't want them necessarily to become religious. I want them to make up their mind. So, you know, they're very young now. So to them, it's kind of like, it's stories. And as they grow up, you know, I don't mind them being exposed to it. And if that's what they want, you know, follow later, they can make up their mind. I am definitely not a rabid atheist who thinks that it will destroy their lives if they believe in God. No, perhaps quite the opposite. Again, just because I myself personally don't feel the need to believe in a supernatural God does not mean that it can't serve a great purpose for others who have a different psychological makeup than I do. So that's a very personal thing to me. Now, of course, when it comes to religion, I do start having an issue when we start talking about more like very fundamentalist or very radical religious views that don't tolerate dissenting points of views and things like that. Then I start potentially having a problem. Obviously, these days, the most prevalent, not the only one, but the most prevalent religion where this happens is Islam. But again, doesn't mean that all of Islam is like this, but there are strands of Islam where this happens to be, in this historical time, seems to be an issue right now. Well, at times it has been an issue with Christianity, in certain parts of the world at certain times too.
Right.
So.
Well, you're sort of, I don't want to make a political judgment on you, but I've heard some of your conversations on Karen's channel. I mean, in terms of your posture with respect to this, you're fairly libertarian. I mean, you want people to, I mean, that's right. Reflected in your attitude toward your children. You want people to have the freedom to choose if they want to participate in religious institutions, if they don't, and obviously no governmental intrusion and the relationship between, what we would, I mean, it's pretty clear that by the time of the Reformation, the Roman Catholic Church had the political power to be tyrannical, and a good deal of what happened with Martin Luther, I mean, the more he was pushed by threats of being burned at the stake, the more he reacted in terms of positions. And so there's a lot of reactivity that in the West over the course of the 30 Years' War and that period in Europe began to say, let's not kill each other over doctrinal differences within Christianity.
Right.
And that's been a good thing. And I think just about anybody most in America would argue, but that drawing that line there is not always easy, because obviously religious ideas impact political ideas, and
Yeah, all right.
these things.
I agree.
These things go
I
back
think
and
you
forth.
cannot make a sharp distinction between religion and culture in general. I mean, the two have influenced each other in many different ways. It's almost impossible to tease out. Like, for example, the Pinker thesis that it's all about the Enlightenment and religion is evil. And thankfully, we had the Enlightenment to get rid of all these crazy ideas that Christianity was imposing on the world or trying to impose. That doesn't make any sense. Now, I think you can go the opposite way and say, well, it's all Christianity all the way and everything else. I think Christianity is a huge factor, and absolutely know that. I think whenever you make that point, I completely agree with you. I think I would slightly say, well, Christianity itself has been influenced by other currents and other cultural ideas, and including, some ancient pagan ideas to some minor, some people would say more greater extent, some lesser extent. I don't think it's that great, but I do think the influence of Christian ideas, specific Christian ideas, on the evolution of the Western world, the Western societies, has been immense, and it's difficult to overstate it. So the Tom Holland thesis that you've been, I quite agree with that. That's a fact. So I consider myself a cultural Christian in that sense.
Okay.
So,
Well, why don't we get into your first point there, because I copied them in the notes here. The concept of God number one and God number two.
all right.
And how I see them. This is you writing. How I see them applied to my own life and worldview. We're already sort of talking about that.
Right.
And in particular, why it's difficult for me to believe in God number two. So, if people haven't watched my videos, one of the things that when I was watching Jordan Peterson talk to Sam Harris with Brett Weinstein, it occurred to me, reflecting on the history of Christianity, especially in the 70s with the born again movement, there's always these two senses in Christianity of God. And I use often Isaiah 6 in terms of holy, holy, holy. That's in a sense God's transcendence. The whole earth is full of his glory, that God is in a sense built into everything. And so the built-inness, and even in an impersonal, mechanistic, naturalistic way, is sort of God number one. God number two is this active agent, conscious, decider, will, intentionality, purpose.
Right.
That's much more the God number two. And one of the things that I saw Jordan Peterson, in a sense, reintroducing is the functional idea of God in the built-inness, the impersonalness that just sort of makes all of the equations in the West work. So
right. And that's part of why I think, after reflection, I was thinking, well, why is it that I feel closer in general to my religious friends than to my rabid atheist? I don't have too many rabid atheist friends. I mean, most of them are nicer than, they're not like, religious people are evil and should be committed to mental institutions. I don't think I have any friend like that. And part of it is this, because they do believe that there is something greater, as I do. I believe in the natural law. So you could equate your God one. I often say, well, I think it's what I call natural law. So it is the laws of nature that we are subject to, and there's nothing, we can't avoid them. The problem is people don't understand, when they think of laws of nature, they think of laws of physics or chemistry or maybe biology. But when we talk about the human world, there are also laws that apply to the human world, but they are much, much more complex. So that's where we get into this complexity versus complicated. The complexity of the human world is such that the types of rules and the types of laws that apply to it are very different nature than the laws of physics. But they are laws nonetheless. And that's why this implicit knowledge that culture and society contains without it being explicitly stated is critical to our survival. And I think, to me, rather than emphasizing, as you seem to do, the difference between people who put forward the scientific image, and recently you've been using the Wilfrid Sellers terminology, manifest image versus scientific image. It's a very good distinction, but the distinction I think is even more important is a distinction between people who recognize that a lot of our knowledge is just not explicit. But people like Sam Harris, seems to me, hold the position that if knowledge is not explicit, it's not knowledge. It doesn't exist. That is so wrong that it's hard for me to overemphasize how wrong that is. This distributed cognition that, using the Vervaeke term, is critical, and it means that our culture, our heritage, our traditions are full of knowledge about the world that none of us can explicitly explain and state, but is nevertheless very, very important to our lives. This is something, that's a concept that I think I mentioned that in one of the videos I did with Karen, but Frederick Hayek is the economist that won the Nobel Prize way back, I think in the 50s or 60s. And at the time I wasn't thinking of it in those terms, but he was the first one that exposed me to the idea that society contains a lot of knowledge that no single individual can encapsulate. And I think people like Sam Harris have a hard time with that. They cannot fathom the fact that there's a lot of things that are very useful, knowledge that helps us cope with the world as it is, that we don't understand.
Right.
We know them, but we don't understand. Just like a child understands how to speak English, but if you ask my 5-year-old who can speak pretty good English what the rules of English grammar are, she has no idea.
Right.
And yet she knows how to speak English.
Right.
But she can't explain it.
Well,
and a lot of things in life are exactly like this.
That's right.
And I think one of the great things you've done is to point this out, that just because we can't pinpoint exactly how it is that we know something, or that it's not a scientific fact, doesn't make it useless and doesn't make it not real.
Right. And I think John Vervaeke's work has been helpful on that. You have so propositional truth.
Right.
Part of the difficulty that we have, and I think this is accentuated actually by the information tools that we have now deployed, which are enormously powerful.
Right.
That the propositional aspect of knowledge is greatly, it's just become everything to us.
Right.
But we fail to recognize that, and I think you just said it very, very well. There's all this implicit knowledge that we, and this is where we're sort of mysterious to ourselves. We sort of know it, just like I think your example of a 5-year-old speaking English, but having, it's fairly well on into your education when you begin to learn grammar, and they start teaching you this grammar, and it's like, why am I learning this? I talk good.
That's right. That's right. Exactly.
But that's obviously a way to scale, lots of other things, learning other languages, so on and so forth. But I think you said it very, very well, that the likes of Sam Harris and many others, they dismiss the rest of knowing.
Right.
And
if they can't explain it, it's not, to them, it's not real.
Right.
But the other person that, a scientist that later on influenced me in thinking about this also is an economist, also a Nobel Prize winner, Vernon Smith. And so I have one of his books here, and the title is
Vernon who? It just dropped out.
Vernon Smith.
Smith. Okay.
Right. And so he won a Nobel Prize like in the early 80s, I think, in economics. Well, there's no Nobel Prize in economics. It's the Nobel whatever. It's the Nobel Memorial Prize in economics. But the title of the book I've got on the shelf here is called Rationality in Economics, and the subtitle is Constructive versus Ecological Kinds. So what he calls constructive rationality is this explicit knowledge, the scientific image, I guess, if you want to equate it to what you've been using recently. And then what he calls ecological rationality is this diffuse, distributed, not always explicit, very often implicit knowledge that we do possess, but we are we have a difficult time, or sometimes we just can't articulate it at all. And yet it is still knowledge. So he has a much more formal view of this, but again, it's his emphasis on the fact that just because we can't rationally tease out exactly what our knowledge consists of does not make it less real. And again, so that's another great influence on my thought, is Vernon Smith.
Listening to you, number one, whereas I completely agree with you about this explicit versus implicit knowledge, I don't think that really maps onto manifest versus scientific image.
Yeah, not exactly. Right. No, I agree. No, in fact, if it mapped exactly, then I would say, well, just use their terminology. I don't mind. But I'm bringing it up because I think it is a different distinction.
Yes.
And I think it's more useful. In my opinion, that's my humble opinion.
Yes.
I think it better explains the difference between, let's say, Sam Harris and you. I think. I'm not sure. You can argue that. I'm willing. Yeah. That's fine. In fact, we don't have to talk about it now. You can think about it.
I will.
And mull it over, and maybe in a future video you can say what you think about it. To me personally, it helps me better to sort out what the issues are in the world. People on the one hand, doesn't make your distinction, between, or Sellers' distinction invalid. It's just different ways of seeing the world.
Yes.
I think there are just ways that are a little bit more useful and some are less useful or whatever. And this is definitely arguable. I'm absolutely not dismissing everything you've done. It's fantastic. So I don't want to be misconstrued as are trying to argue against you about this. No, it's just bringing a different perspective to the game.
Have you looked into Michael Polanyi much?
A little bit. Well, based on what I had heard about him, but I know I have not. And if I remember well, I was not agreeing with what at the time.
Because he talked a lot about, and I haven't looked into him very deeply either, but his big frame was tacit knowledge, which I think in some ways, and again, I don't think it maps perfectly onto it, but seems analogous to the implicit knowledge that you're talking about.
And Professor Vervaeke's, the practical knowledge, perspectival, as opposed to propositional, kind of maps a little bit into that. I mean, he has 4 categories, but nevertheless, I think it does relate in very distinct ways to what I'm talking about. So I was happy to see him, bring this up. That propositional knowledge is not the only type of knowledge. That's the main point.
Yeah,
and that's why also, we mentioned earlier politically I might be closer to the libertarian side, but I actually consider myself more of a conservative because of this. Because I think Jordan Peterson, has been classified as a conservative in certain quarters by probably unfairly. That's not the way he sees himself, but. But I think it's for that reason, because he was one person who re-emphasized the importance of this knowledge that is culturally acquired, and he emphasized the great risk in simply dismissing that knowledge, erasing it, and then wanting to start over from scratch. That's at our great, great peril. And of course, the events of the 20th century, as I've pointed out before, with communism and Nazism and some of the great tragedies that were politically motivated or induced, I think are directly related to this effort, this conviction, this hubristic effort to erase all previous knowledge from society and start from zero, and build a brand new world from these new notions that were supposedly more rational. I mean, scientific communism, scientific socialism, or Marxism was supposed to be much more rational way to order society, to make it more efficient. And some people in the West thought, oh yeah, absolutely. The communists are they're gonna be way ahead of us economically. By the end of the 20th century, they'll surpass, because they do it the smart way, right? They do it the rational way. They're organized. That's a complete failure to understand complex systems. Complete, utter failure. It's grotesque almost. Now, of course, Karl Marx, he was writing way before complexity theory even came onto the scene. So you can't retroactively blame him for not knowing about complex systems and how they work. But nevertheless, in retrospect, you can see that is why he failed. That's why his ideas failed. It's a complete failure to understand how complex systems operate versus merely complicated systems.
Now, for those listening, why don't you, and I mean, you're really helpful for me when you just kept pushing me on that. I had to do a little bit of digging. Why don't you lay that out a little bit for us?
Right. So systems can be very complicated. Let's say, even a car, an automobile, to a non-mechanically oriented person like me, I can change the oil, and I can maybe I can put air in the tires and stuff. But I'm not going to take apart the engine and put it back together. To me, that's a very complicated system. But it's not a complex system in the sense that when I push the accelerator pedal, I know there's going to be a predictable response. If I push the brake pedal, there's going to be predictable response. There is a direct relationship between how far I push the accelerator pedal and the RPMs, depending on what gear I'm in and so on. So it's a very predictable system, even though it's very complicated. Now, complex systems are systems that are fundamentally unpredictable. So the tiniest input into the system at some point will have major consequences that are not predictable by any scientific means, even formally. Now, there are degrees of complexity. The most, I guess, a simple complex system is sounds like an oxymoron, but there are a double jointed pendulum is kind of like one of the most basic example of complexity, in the sense that, as opposed to a regular pendulum, which you have equations that can very precisely predict what the pendulum is going to do and how it's going to behave, and taking into account friction, you can figure out what the frequency of oscillation is, and when it's going to come to rest at some point, if you take like air resistance and friction effects and stuff like that. In a double jointed pendulum, it is formally impossible to calculate the end state that it's going to, all the gyrations it's going to do. Now, there is no general, let's put it this way, there's no general equation to figure out what it is. So, but even then, that's not a very complicated. It's a very, in terms of complicated versus simple, it's a simple system. But in terms of complexity, it's already kind of a basic complex system. But of course, complexity gets.
Do you think it's impossible that someday they will arrive at a general equation to figure it out, or do you think by definition?
No, it's formally. About the double jointed pendulum, I'm not sure, but for complex systems like human society, yeah, it is formally impossible. I mean, but we can't get into it. It would take, there's a lot of literature on this, and Stuart Kauffman is a good author to talk about this. He talks from a biological point of view. He's one of the people that works at this, or he's probably retired now, but I have a couple of good books. And John Vervaeke, Professor Vervaeke, also was reading. Coincidentally, he was reading one of Kaufman's books at the same time I was, which is recently I was reading A World Beyond Physics, but Stuart Kauffman is an expert in complexity, and he does believe that you cannot reduce the world to physics. So he thinks that for even at the level of biology, we're already way beyond physics. In the level of evolution, it's irreducible to simple physical equations. And you know, it goes into very, very scientific arguments. But in any event, when we come to human society, then the complexity increases by orders of magnitude, because what you have is a system that evolves in reaction to changes in the environment. And on top of that, when you talk about the human world, you have a self-referential system. And when you induce self-reference in any system, you end up having some really interesting and perhaps bizarre effects. And some of those are well known. Kurt Gödel, the mathematician, you know, in the 1930s, was able to use self-reference to prove some very interesting mathematical theorems that were a total shock to the world of mathematics. And also Alan Turing, in the world of computing, was able to demonstrate some things that were also a total shock in the world of computing. One of them was the undecidability theorem. And if you introduce self-reference in a system, you can actually prove that the system becomes completely open-ended, so completely unpredictable. And I think I have come up myself with a formal proof that physical reductionism and physical determinism are impossible. If you want, we can talk briefly about it. I'm writing a paper on it right now. It's hard. It's a very hard thing to do, but yeah, the world cannot be physically deterministic. That's not a possible thing once you introduce self-referential systems.
So
which humans are.
So what are persons then?
Well, I think you've got it right. I think persons are, you know, largely they are a narrative so a person is a story. In many, you know, I think you keep emphasizing that, and I quite agree with that. I think, well, we are a history, for one thing. You know, we are a past, but the story that we have in our mind right now about our past is just a story. It's not the real past. We don't remember everything that we've done, but, you know, not even close. Right. But there are some people with weird memories, like eidetic memories or, you know, photographic memories that get a little closer, but even then, they're not, you know, they don't remember their entire past. For most normal people, what we are is the story that we remember from our past, with, you know, our experiences, and some of it is wrong. Some people are convinced they remember, you know, that I did this. Wait, no, you really didn't. But again, it proves that it's really a story that we tell ourselves, because it's not necessarily fact. Now, hopefully, the story is mostly true. Hopefully, you know, it's not all BS, as John Vervaeke would say, but the ability for people to BS themselves never ceases to astonish. Well, it's just, now once you realize that it's a fact, I think it helps you to try to mitigate that. You can never get completely beyond it, but I think you can sort of, you know, attenuate the effect. But yeah, it's just amazing how what people will believe, and of course, you know, Sam Harris will say, well, that's what religious people are doing to themselves. I disagree. I think that's of a different nature. So it's.
Well, you talked in your list here about Sam Harris and free will. So why don't we're sort of
yes.
at that point. So why don't you go ahead on that?
Well, so let's go back to my proof that. Because this should put rest to any notion that physical determinism is correct. So you've heard about the Benjamin Libet experiments, right?
No.
Well, it's very famous, and Sam Harris, you know, it's back from the 60s, I think. But they've performed similar experiments since then. So that's basically, you know, you ask a person to raise their right hand or left hand, and then you know, you hook him up to back then it was electrodes, maybe electroencephalogram or whatever. And now they do, you know, MRIs, functional fMRIs, whatnot. And they are able to predict like a second, you know, it depends, fractions of a second to maybe several seconds in some cases, supposedly, predict ahead of time what the person, you know, what he's going to do. They're going to raise their right hand. Right. So that to them, to Sam Harris, oh, okay, well, that proves that, you know, we don't really decide ourselves what we're going to do. Well, I'll tell you what, I've got an idea for you. We're gonna do the same experiment, but now, you know, let's say, well, in theory, let's not make it too practical, because scientific determinism is equivalent to the proposition that given, and this is, you know, this goes back to Laplace, the French scientist, and the Laplace's demon, who, you know, if you know all the initial conditions of a certain part of the world, and you have perfect knowledge of the scientific laws of the universe, then you are able to predict, in theory, every future and retrodict every past state of the universe. That's what scientific determinism is. Now, I know quantum mechanics put a big wrench in that whole thing, but for now, let's just, but there's still, some people still go with that notion that, well, in theory, you know, we should be able to predict exactly what happens in the future. So, but now, if I say, okay, well, predict this, what we're going to do is the machine, or whatever it is, Laplace's demon, is going to predict if I'm going to raise my right hand or my left hand at time t. At 10 o'clock this morning, you're going to predict. And in theory, they should be able to predict it like 3 years ahead of time, 10 years, a million years, go back to the Big Bang, you know, which basically right there shows kind of the absurdity of the whole thing. But okay, let's go beyond that. But what we're going to add now is we're going to tell the machine that they have to tell me what the prediction is before I actually move my hand.
Oh.
do you start seeing the problem now?
Yes.
Because in their view, it doesn't matter whether the machine tells me or not. The future is determined perfectly. And so it applies to every single experimental setup, including this one. So the experimental setup where there's this feedback loop, and this is where self-reference comes into play.
Right.
So the feedback, the machine tells you, well, at 10 o'clock, you will raise your right hand. I'm going to say, no. I mean, just out of spite, I'll say, no, I'll raise my left hand. So as soon as you tell me what the prediction is, the prediction becomes impossible.
Right.
As a matter of fact, it's kind of interesting because I can tell the machine, tell you what, I'll make it easy for you. I will raise the opposite hand of what I'm going to make, you know, I'm going to tell you deterministically, I will raise the opposite hand of what you predict. And that makes it formally impossible to predict anything. To me, no, I haven't submitted this as a scientific paper yet, but I believe, and maybe people can critique this, you know, in the comments section. I've exposed a few people in the comments section to this, and some people have accepted it, but sometimes people are like, no, there's got to be something wrong.
For the same reason they're going to raise their left hand.
That's right, exactly. So to me, it seems to me to be a valid formal proof that scientific determinism is impossible, incorrect, in a system where you have self-reference. So that has a huge impact on the idea of free will. Now, first of all, we cannot then use, if I'm correct, again, I'm submitting it for suggestion, comments, you know, rejection, whatever. But it seems to me that I don't see any counter argument. At least I've never seen one so far. Now, granted, again, it's a new idea. I've never seen it put it that way anywhere else. So I think I'm the originator of this. I don't know.
Well,
if somebody's seen it before somewhere else, please let me know. I'd be interested.
I think it's a good argument. The question then comes to, well, where does will come from? because
Right.
just as saying, okay, you're going to predict that I'm going to raise my right hand in 30 seconds, well, doggone it, I'm going to raise my left hand. And someone would say, yeah, I've watched Vanderklay enough. He's Vanderklay and Gruner are contrarians enough that those idiots are going to raise their left hand just out of spite. Well, now we have another factor in the equation, which is spite and our contrarian nature.
Right.
And so then so Sam Harris's rather facile, and I think you articulated it very well, is rather facile understanding of from the Big Bang on. And this is, I mean, when you read, say, C.S. Lewis's Miracles, what C.S. Lewis is really,
which I have read, yes,
he's really commenting exactly what you said on Sam Harris's from the Big Bang. It's all billiard balls all the way out. Okay,
right.
So there it is, and I think you rightly said, no, there's these things in the middle of it that are going to raise their left hand instead of their right hand, which is going to throw off your computations because it's self-referential, and we are watchers in the middle of the process, which is, Jordan Peterson quickly on said, this is why it's impossible to predict the stock market, because it's just a market of watchers. And
stock market is self-referential. I mean,
yeah.
George Soros, who's definitely not one of my heroes, but he wrote a book. He called it reflexivity, but it's the same idea.
Yeah.
But that when people sell, that it tends to induce more selling, and vice versa. So it is very self-referential in many ways.
But at the heart of Sam's argument is that Sam is saying there are no choosers in there. And you very much have choosers, but then you have the question, well, what exactly are these choosers in there?
Right. But see, that's what's interesting. So in my thought experiment, what determines, it's interesting because what determines the outcome essentially is me deciding that in the future. So actually you have this is not metaphorically, so it's real. It's the future influences the present. As opposed to, in Sam Harris's world, only the past can influence the present.
Right.
In my world of emerging properties of the universe, emerging from complexity, one of the emergent properties is consciousness, and one of the emerging properties is rationality. And the rationality allows us to predict the future. Now you say, what? What did you just say? We can predict the future? Well, of course, not perfectly. If not, we'd all be millionaires because we could all predict the stock market. But for the reasons I just explained, you cannot predict the future exactly, but we can predict it enough to take action, and
therefore change the future too.
Correct. We can predict that, to some extent probabilistically. But let's say if I commit a crime, I might go to prison. That case there's a good chance. And that if I commit a crime, or if I, that could hurt somebody. I mean, most people have empathy or sympathy, so they won't commit a crime just based on that. But some people are born with, deficiencies, or they're called sociopaths or psychopaths. And that is why we have sort of established a substitute way for them to think about the future. So instead of thinking, for them, something they can't relate to, which is, it's bad that you're going to hurt these people because they don't care. What we do is, your future will be miserable because we're going to put you in prison or maybe even execute you if you commit a grievous crime. And they actually can understand that. Now, that some people still can't, and we call them mentally incompetent, and that's why in the jurisprudence we do have a defense called, not guilty by reason of insanity. So we do recognize our jurisprudence system does recognize those differences. In Sam Harris's world, none of these distinctions can be made. Right. In his jurisprudence, a toddler has the same amount of responsibility as a fully grown adult. In his deterministic world, there is no difference. Or if there is, I'd like for him to explain it. He seems to think that his view that there is no free will makes for a better world, a gentler kind of world, right? Because we're no longer going to be retributive towards criminals. We're just like an animal we're going to treat him like, he uses the example of the bear that comes into a neighborhood and wreaks havoc, and we put him into a cage, but we don't put him on trial. We don't condemn him. You know, the bear does not know any better. So, and to him, he's saying, yeah, people should be treated the same thing, which is completely absurd. I mean, when you think about it, he doesn't live his life that way. I mean, he doesn't even believe what, you know, based on his action, he doesn't even believe what he says. He can't. It's just not possible. You wouldn't treat a child. And what is the difference between a 2-year-old or even a 10-year-old or a person with some, you know, mental issues, let's say, is their ability to predict the future consequences of their action. That is the distinction. That is what the judicial system takes into account, and rightly so. That is why we can hold people responsible for their actions. That is why we can say people do author themselves to some extent. Of course, not completely. We're also subject to many forces that we don't understand, many influences, many things, but there is at least some minimal extent where we are able to author ourselves. The example I gave you, you know, I'm authoring myself in a way by deciding ahead of time that whatever your prediction is, I'm going to do the opposite.
Right.
So I don't even know what you're going to predict yet, right? So I don't know what I'm going to do. Now, it turns out that formally it becomes impossible to make a prediction. But if it were possible, I am, in a way, authoring myself. And you say, well, what relevance does this thought experiment have on real life? Well, it does, because we do this all the time.
Yeah.
We decide ahead of time, if I am in a situation where, let's say, I could steal something from somebody else, I'm just deciding right now. I'm not even in the situation yet. I'm not there. I'm not confronted with any decision yet. But ahead of time, I'm deciding right now that in case, it's purely theoretical, in case I am put in a situation where I have the opportunity, let's say, to maybe steal something and perhaps get away with it, I just won't do it.
And I think,
in that sense, it's very real to say I am self-authoring myself.
Yeah.
That's why the Jordan Peterson self-authoring program, where you write down what your vision is of your future self, let's say a year from now, 6 months from now, is effective. It works. It works. Because that vision of the future actually influences your present. To me, this is all very real. It's not metaphorical, it's real. And that's also why, you know, again, you cannot reduce the human mind to physics. It's impossible. When you have a vision of the future like this, you cannot reduce it to the physics of the present. Automatically, it goes beyond the physics of the present. Yeah. Automatically, it does. And to me, I've pointed out this is an emergent property. It's not a mysterious supernatural, you know, and you can debate this. You can say, well, this proves somehow that, maybe not prove, that's too strong a word, but doesn't it show that there is more to just the material world? And I say, yes, there is, but that doesn't mean that it's supernatural. So I make a very sharp distinction between purely physical and natural. So I do believe
interesting.
Right. So, for example, to me, consciousness is not physical, but it's natural. So it emerges from physical processes. But once it's emerged, once it has emerged, it is no longer reducible to physical, to a physical description, or to a description of the physical state of the entity. It goes beyond that.
You know, to me, it's
still natural.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah. No, and this is super helpful for me. This is really helpful for me,
well,
especially.
I thought it would be.
Yeah, it really is.
And I've tried to convey this in some of the comments, but obviously in a real conversation like this, it's much easier to perhaps, you know, convey some of these things. And I'm sure, you know, you have so many comments, there's no way you can read them all. So
well, I almost always look at yours because you have good comments. Well, you do. And this is, you know, this is why I say hierarchies bind and blind, because the more comments there are, the more viewers there are, the more difficult it is for me so you know, we have this, and I really appreciate the fact that you're so interested in economists, because economists are, you know, people looking at large systems. And the
Right.
more viewers I have on my channel, the larger the system becomes, the more dependent I am on certain conventional signal givers. And
Right.
so, you know, now instead of having 5 people in a week say, you should watch this video, now I've got 500. Well, how do I decide? You know, and so now I have an economist's challenge to figure out where the best sources of information are. And, you know, Karl doesn't have a YouTube channel with 1 million subscribers, so why should I listen to him? So from my perspective, I'm always trying to figure out, you know, how to listen, because to me, one of the huge blessings of my YouTube channel has been people like you, because now I have opportunity to meet people that I might not normally meet, and I can learn a tremendous amount from you. So
Yeah, and we, of course, we all on your channel because we learned a lot from you. So, you know, you're one of the best teachers out there.
well, thank you.
You know, as far as clearly and fairly, I must say, this is a very important quality, that you're very fair in your exposition. To the extent that I will disagree with you, say something that you might have said, it's never because it was your intention to deceive. Never, ever. It's always in good faith, right?
I hope
perhaps
so.
No, that's why I love your channel. I mean, you know, it's not a very usual quality. And of course, you know, you're a Calvinist pastor, so you will have your set views on certain subjects, but I've been absolutely amazed at how open-minded you are, you know, coming from that position of Calvinist pastor. And I remember once you made the comment that, I think it was other people have noted this, that it's kind of dangerous for you to put yourself out there, you know, expose yourself to other ideas. And you've commented on this before on several of your videos, that some people would prefer that you not do that you not discuss these ideas with others, because, you know, somehow it's dangerous. To me, I really put the truth above everything. So I always love discussing. The only thing that I don't have your patience with people like you do. Well, it depends. I have a lot of patience with people as long as they're making, you know, I don't mind people having different ideas as long as they're making the effort to understand and you know, but when I see people stubbornly refuse to accept any evidence, any whatsoever, then I just have to quit. You know, it's like, it's not worth my time. That's something that unfortunately does happen occasionally. On your channel, not very much. Most people that are on your channel are very open-minded. But so that's why I like, and that's why I really like, you know, Karen is one person that's also is like you, is very open-minded, and she has her ideas, and she tries to convince me about this and that, but I try to politely, you know, push back on those things that I think maybe she doesn't have quite right. I mean, that's fine. You know, we get along very well, even though we don't see eye to eye on a few things, but that's not a big deal. You know, I respect her. I respect Mary Bohan very much, even though I even have more differences with her for sure. And occasionally it's gotten a little tense, but we resolved it. You know, we figured things out.
You should definitely talk to Mary too.
Yes.
Good conversation.
No, she has some really excellent videos, particularly her comments on the Cardinal Ratzinger, and you know, there's a lot of really, really good things. I agree with a lot of the things she says. Because I do believe that there's, you know, that man is not the measure of all things. That there are higher, you know, I don't call them higher powers, but there are higher laws that we are subject to, and that we ignore at our own peril.
Why do you use the word laws there? You're sort of scaling up from laws of physics, and laws is a funny word even for laws of physics.
Well, there are a lot. For example, see, like game theory is a science, right? So game theory or cybernetics, the science of systems control theory. It's not physics, but it's still a science. And those are extremely important when you try to figure out how the human world works. Now, these are things that are relatively new, you know. So game theory does eliminate greatly, maybe not 100%, but it does eliminate greatly many of the behaviors that people engage in and have, and why, you know, why it is that people do certain things. One of the, you know, I've mentioned him many times before in comments and videos, but Nassim Taleb, even though he's kind of an interesting character and does not mince his words, and he's not the best talker, but I've read all his books, and I think if you just stick to the ideas that he puts forward, he's right on. You know, he's one of the people that made me understand. Now he comes at it from a probability and statistics point of view, but it all points to the same thing. He does point out to the great danger of ignoring the implicit knowledge of society, and he does it by showing out, you know, he comes at it from a study of probabilities and statistics. So again, that it is a science, and one of his big things is that people like Sam Harris or Steven Pinker and many others, and by the way, a lot of economists as well, and you know, part of the reason that he sort of predicted, he didn't predict the exact timing, but he predicted the 2008 financial crisis ahead of time, because he predicted that the financial system was very fragile, and subject to, you know, a shock could easily bring the whole thing collapsing down. But one of the key confusions that scientists, even, you know, people with PhDs have, was confusing uncertainty with mere probability distribution. So the radical uncertainty is what happened in complex systems. Like I mentioned, complex systems are radically unpredictable. It doesn't matter. You can have all the equations in the world. It doesn't matter. And that's what Taleb emphasizes. The world is very complex. And yet some people still think that you can predict, you know, probabilistically, you can more or less fit everything to some kind of distribution curve. And even though you can only predict the distribution, you can still predict the range of possibilities that the world can come to. He says that's a grave, grave mistake. The world, being complex, is fundamentally unpredictable. And the kinds of rules that you will apply to a complex world are very, very different in nature than the rules you will apply to a merely complicated world. And that's how we get to a financial crisis like 2008. People thought that the world was more or less predictable within a certain bound. You know, it's either a Gaussian distribution or some other kind of statistical distribution. And then, you know, yes, you know, we can't predict exactly where it's going to fall, but it's going to be in that range with a certain degree of probability. And Taleb's point was, no, you don't understand. There are certain events which he calls black swan. He popularized that term, right. You know, the black swan event, the very unpredictable things that nobody was able to figure out ahead of time. That's what's going to come and bite you. And so it's one thing to know that you don't know everything. You know, that there are certain things that you don't know ahead of time. But the great danger is to thinking you know something when you really don't. And I think there was a Mark Twain quote about something like this. I can't remember the exact quote, but Mark Twain supposedly said something like, it's not what you don't know what that will get you, it's what you know but just ain't so. Right? So you think you know it, but it's just not right.
Right.
You're convinced you know.
Right.
And again, that's exactly what precipitated the financial crisis and many other cases of crises and wars and all kinds of things.
Yeah.
People thought they knew.
Yeah.
And also it brings back the famous or infamous Donald Rumsfeld's quote about the known unknowns.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds funny, and late show host had a field day with that, but fundamentally Rumsfeld was correct in what he was saying.
Yeah.
There are the known unknowns and there are the unknown unknowns.
Yes.
And confusing the two is the road to perdition.
Yes.
So as long as you understand that there are many things you don't know, but you are aware of it, you're probably okay, because you can take preventive measures. And that's Taleb's thing. He says you can actually take preventive measures to mitigate the possibilities or the impact of the complete uncertainty. But you can only do that if you don't confuse it with statistical averages. A great example he gives is, let's say you are in front of a river and you need to ford the river. And somebody tells you, well, it's perfectly fine to ford the river because on average, it's only 4 feet deep. And they say you're 6 foot tall, right? So you say, okay, on average, it's 4 feet deep. Everything is fine. Well, just because on average it's 4 feet deep doesn't mean that there's not a 10-foot hole somewhere and you're going to die. And one of the things that's very important is once you die, there's no coming back, right? So that's it. You're done. So it doesn't matter that statistically, on average, you'll be okay. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Because if you do the time dependence of the actual trajectory, when you get to the point where you die, you're done. That's it. There's no coming back and say, oops, I should have taken another path. You're done. So, again, Taleb has been fantastic at explaining how that works. I can't overemphasize, how important his work is. Again, he's not the most approachable, not the most kind-hearted, he can be very, very virulent and arrogant. But nevertheless, his ideas, I think, stand.
So where do you think because, one would imagine that living a certain number of years in the world, we would have cemented in our mind that, the fundamental, our fundamental inability to predict the future. Because if you're watching people at all, you'll have to say, boy, things are always surprising moving forward. And so that this point that you've been making very eloquently should be something that all of us should be something so boring and ubiquitously agreed upon that you and I wouldn't be wasting any time on YouTube making it. But we are.
Right.
Because
yes, I know.
And because human beings, why do we resist this idea, even though it seems something that is just absolutely self-evident to anybody paying any attention at all?
Well, but traditional culture or society, at least in the Western world, has taken this into account. I mean, that's why we have all these rules of behavior that we follow many times. We're taught those things from early childhood, save for a day where, hardship, so it's a fundamental thing that's ingrained, the tale, the Aesop's tales of it's the ant and the grasshopper, the ant that saves for the winter and the grasshopper is singing all summer. These are basic stories that we learn as children that are meant to help us cope with the fundamental uncertainty of the world. We don't know if we're going to have food next week or next, in 6 months. So the fundamental rule is save for a rainy day. It's not that complicated, right? I mean, it still doesn't make us, we still don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but at least we'll have taken precautions.
But my question is, where does the other idea come from? It seems obvious where this idea would come from over time, and a very Jordan Peterson, Darwinist idea about these stories are here all the time because the instability of the world should be to us the most obvious aspect of life in the world. But this other idea, you know, is very strong, which is, oh, we've got this thing well in hand. I mean, that's the crazy idea.
This is this scientific, and I would say pseudoscientific, because it's not truly scientific, but it's hubris that precisely, again, you know, it brings us back to Taleb's point that many people who are supposed professionals and know a lot about certain subjects, they think they know a lot more than they do, and they think they're really able to predict the future when in fact they are not able to. It is a complete, it is, so to them, you know, the scientists, the fact that the river is on average only 4 feet deep, it's a good enough fact to go on. I mean, there's, you know, a good book, it's a Daniel Kahneman. Have you read Thinking Fast and Slow?
No, I haven't, but
it's a very good book. But again, the research is excellent and the conclusion is false. And now since then he's talked to Taleb, and Taleb actually it's an interview I think it's at the New York Library, so they're both talking. And one of the things that Kahneman says early on in the talk is, after reading Taleb, he said it fundamentally altered the way I view the world. So Kahneman actually admitted that Taleb's views radically changed the way he thought about things. Because when you read the book, a lot of the research he did, he got a Nobel Prize for it with his colleague, Aaron Tversky, his colleague, did not get the Nobel Prize only because he died before the prize was awarded. And I guess they don't do posthumous prizes. So that was kind of unfortunate because they already both deserved it. But anyway, the book is very good. It's about all these human biases that we have, you know, these weird quirks and all that. And to Kahneman, it's like, well, that shows that we're, you know, fundamentally irrational, and that therefore the government should step in and make us rational. Right? They should make the rational decisions for us because we're kind of stupid that way, you know. And Taleb's point is, no, you don't get it. You don't get it. Yes, we're kind of irrational in that way. But what appears irrational at first, when you dig deeper, actually, it's full of wisdom. There are a lot of reasons why we do things this way. And it's precisely because we're not dealing with probabilistic distribution. We're dealing with a world where there is radical uncertainty of the future. And the way you deal with one is very different than the way you deal with the other. So basically, Taleb says, you know, if you're faced with listening to this PhD in mathematics or economics about, you know, what to do, or listening to your grandmother, listen to your grandmother. 99.9% of the time, she'll be all right. All right. So he emphasizes the wisdom of the crowds in a way.
History.
Of history, exactly, of culture. You know, our culture is basically a summary, you know, summation of the knowledge of previous generations that's been passed on, you know, imperfectly, but nevertheless, knowledge. Well enough. Exactly, implicit knowledge. Some of it is explicit, and more and more of it is becoming explicit.
Yes.
But I think because of this, it's lulled a lot of, you know, scientists into this sense of complacency, just because we've made more and more of the knowledge explicit. They took the wrong lesson out of that. Basically, the lesson they got out of this is, well, then from now on, everything that's not explicit, we're just going to ignore or reject or dismiss because it's not, quote unquote, scientific. That's a grave mistake. Well, I mean, it's good that we're getting more and more explicit about things, but although we have to be very, very careful about it. Again, you know, like I say, a lot of the decisions that societies make and a lot of the rules that we follow without knowing why, retroactively, post hoc, we can sort of explain with things like game theory and systems control theory. Like, for example, it's well known in economics that, you know, the role of unintended consequences. So the government takes a measure, you know, imposes a new law, you know, controlling a certain part of the market or whatever, some tariffs. And of course, as has been pointed out many, many times, unintended consequences follow, right? Well, if you know anything about complexity theory, about systems control theory, and about feedback loops, about negative feedback loops versus positive feedback loops, you know, the science of this explains a lot of the reasons for that. You know, if you put a new law or rule in place, which will tend to induce a positive feedback loop, which will lead for the system to get more and more out of control. And typically what we call this in colloquial language is a vicious circle. So you know, you get one action started and it makes things worse and worse and worse. It kind of feeds back on itself to the point, you know, the typical positive feedback mechanism that I pointed out before is when a microphone being too close to the amp, to the speaker, and then you get this feedback loop and you get this super loud squeal that eliminates all sound, because the system feeds back on itself. The speaker picks up the sound from the microphone picks up the sound from the speaker and it feeds back on itself. And it's very, very easy, if you're not careful, to induce those kinds of feedback mechanisms in society. So the so-called scientists who think, oh, let's tell you what, we've got a solution to poverty. We're just gonna give money to people. And Jordan Peterson's been great about doing this, pointing out, well, wait a second, it's not that simple, okay? Yeah. And you know, we may not have all the solutions, but let's not fool ourselves into thinking that we've got these simple solutions to perennial problems, as Berkeley would put it, like poverty and you know, inequality and all these things. And somehow now that we know, you know, now we have this scientific knowledge, we're going to be able to just wave our hand and come up with these government solutions to all these things and make everybody happy, and everything will be rosy, and you know, it'll be rivers of milk and things. I mean, I can't believe the naivete of some of these people that are talking like that. I mean, of course, I'm exaggerating. Obviously, they don't put it quite in those terms, but to me, that's what it sounds like. And they say, no, you can't treat a complex society, a complex, evolutive, self-referential society like you treat a car engine. Where you say, well, if I put a little bit more oil, if I tweak the belt timing or something, it'll make it work better. Right? No, that's not the way it works at all. Yeah. Completely wrong. You're on the wrong track. And as a matter of fact, you're so much on the wrong track that if you push it hard enough, you end up with 100 million dead, like in the 20th century, right? So it's not just theoretically bad. It's like in practice, when you implement this kind of ideas, you know, obviously, hopefully, we know better now, and we can maybe, you know, correct the feedback before it gets bad enough. But history shows us that it's very easy for these things to get out of control. So we have to be very, very careful.
Well, it's interesting because we have some things that we are pushing into the systems that are being pushed in by intention. And in many ways, what governments are deployment devices for intentionality, as opposed to, I mean, you've had some really interesting conversations with Karen about markets.
Yeah, because Ira Katz, he's like me. He's adherent to the Austrian school of, you know, the Austrian economics school, Ludwig von Mises and Hayek. So that was very interesting. And then you had some further comments about, please go ahead.
Well, yeah. So, you know, so on one hand, you have governments that are these huge, you know, one of the things that I've often noted too was that intentionality as a strategy over the last number of years has been promoted as, this is, if we're all more intentional, then what? Well, part of the problem is that and this is something that Christianity has a lot of questions about, because when we start talking about telos or eschatology or, you know, some final goodness, well, even biblical imagery about final goodness, you find that, well, streets of gold, eternity, I mean, all these images, many of them are sort of, you know, the opposite of things that we don't like. And that shows that if you would ask someone, you know, the most common question that Jesus asked people are, what do you want? Because we all sort of have this suspicion that if I get what I want, then I'll be happy, or life will be worthwhile, or so on and so forth. So, you know, so then we have this cult of intentionality where we say, oh, well, and this is where, you know, certain brands of politics get going, because what we need to do is marshal political power and then use the mechanisms of government to deploy ideas, and that will, and, you know, we saw, again, I think, as you said very well, we saw that played out in the Soviet Union, and it was a catastrophe, and we realized just how we are not anywhere near as smart as we know, and just like I think you said very well, the explicit knowledge that we can manipulate is insufficient to yield even the outcomes we think we desire.
Right. Well, one way to
think
about
side of it, there's the other side of it,
you were not done.
Where we have all of this unintentional stuff, such as, for example, I've been reflecting recently on, and Vervaeke, you know, has too, and many others have, okay, the rise of social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. We have no idea, you know, what on earth, especially when we recognize this self-referential, the power of the self-referential aspect in terms of human futurity. It's like, wow, we've just mindlessly deployed something of immense power that we have zero understanding of where it's going to take us.
No, but things like that have happened, man, you know, throughout history. You know, of course, this, you could argue this one is more dramatic in a way. I mean, it is, it's scary in a way. I mean, you know, even in the future, you get potential, you know, artificial intelligence to be, you know, a serious topic about, you know, where it's going to lead us as a society and things like that. But, you know, to me, I say, well, I don't think we're that close to it yet, and we'll, you know, it's good that there are some people are worrying about it now, but we're not there yet. We got a little bit of time to see it coming. But in any event, you're right. I mean, there is, not everything that's intentional is good, and not everything that's unintentional is good. I think there is a right balance. That's why I'm not an anarchist, right? So some people are what they call anarcho-capitalists or anarcho. You know, they want no government. You know, everything is going to be spontaneous and, you know, spontaneous order. No, I think there is a role for government, particularly because there are effects in the market that the market does not take into consideration, and they're well known. These are not, you know, like mysterious. You know, there are like pollution is the typical example. You know, third-party effects. So they are externalities is the technical term. So, you know, you basically a transaction between two people imposing a cost on a third party that's not involved in the transaction to start with, right? And so those, the kinds of legitimate government interventions that are required are needed, you know, to make the system work. So, and it's not the only ones. There are other things. There is a role for government, but I see it as rather limited to me. But okay, you know, that's an argument for another time. The big thing is that is to recognize that. Well, you know, again, it goes back to like some you know, grandmother's wisdom. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Have you heard that one before?
Oh,
I'm sure you have. Everybody has, right? And people will dismiss it, but no, it's true. It already is true. It doesn't mean like, okay, every good intention is bound to be, you know, have catastrophic consequences. All it means is that one ought to be cautious, and that good intentions by themselves are not enough. You don't stop, oh, my intention was good, therefore everything that follows is going to be good. No. That's one of my big beefs with progressive politics, is it seems to be all about intentions. And no, I mean, okay, good intentions are great. There's nothing wrong with them. It's certainly a lot better than bad intentions, right? But just to say, well, all we need is good intentions and our work is done, we can all feel good about ourselves. It's like, no. And a lot of good intentions, by the way, end up in total disaster. I'm sure the communists, in the revolution in 1917, their intentions were good. I don't want to attribute, maybe some of these people didn't have good, I don't know, but I'm presuming that intentions were good. But that's not enough. You can't stop and say, well, their intentions were good. So yeah, well, but still 100 million dead. Okay. So
not a good outcome.
To hell is paved with good intentions.
Yes.
And so it doesn't mean that we should dismiss good intentions, but it should mean we always ought to proceed with caution.
Yes.
And that just because people have all these bright ideas about, oh, we're gonna have this utopian society, where everybody is gonna be happy and we're gonna redistribute income and it's gonna make everybody happy. We're gonna have this universal basic income, and everything will be fine, and people will, it'll resolve all our problems. No. And again, Jordan Peterson has been great about pointing to that simplistic view of the world is just not accurate. It doesn't reflect reality. Yeah. You can't view the world that way and be successful. You have to have a little bit more nuanced and complex view of how things really work.
Yeah. And even then, you don't know it all.
No, it's right. I mean, again, knowing that you don't know it all is very important. So, again, the greatest danger, going back to that supposed Mark Twain quote, it's not what you don't know that will kill you or will harm you, or whatever the exact quote is. It's not that it will harm you, it's what you know, but that just ain't so. You think you know it, but it's just not right. And that is very, very prevalent. Particularly in the light of confirmation bias and all these biases that Kahneman points out in the book, Thinking Fast and Slow. On that point, the book is excellent. I mean, it does show all these built-in biases that we have that are very difficult to get beyond. Confirmation bias is like prevalent. I mean, it is just ubiquitous. It's everybody. It's. I just happen to have more of like a contrarian mind. So it doesn't mean I'm not subject to confirmation bias. But my first thought when somebody says something is like, how can I prove him wrong? Right? I mean, no kidding. I have this like, no way. Wait a second. And it got me in trouble in college because when I would argue with the professors, right? Quite trouble, not big trouble, not big trouble. Right. I still got really good grades, and that was fine. It didn't
make you popular necessarily in some.
But all right, exactly. Because all the other students are like, yeah, if the teacher or the professor says so, it must be all right. I'm like, no. Sorry, but I have to question this. And sometimes, I reflect, like, okay, well, I can't come up with anything, right? So I guess, okay, temporarily, at least I will accept the idea. But too many people are like, they face this newfangled idea. Like Don Hoffman. Okay, well, let's start.
Yeah. Get into. We have to wrap this up, but go ahead.
That is a great example to illustrate my point. Okay, so Don Hoffman comes up with this newfangled theory that this consciousness is primary, and that our senses are not there to show us a picture of reality. They're just an interface between consciousnesses. And immediately to me, like, no, it's not. I mean, it's absurd. I mean, if Don Hoffman really believes what he said, let me give you several arguments against Don Hoffman that I came up with within 5 minutes of hearing him talk for the first time, right?
Okay.
And I think I heard about him first on your channel, but then I looked into it and said, oh, that sounds kind of interesting. But within 5 minutes, I had like 5 arguments against Don Hoffman's thesis. Because I say, well, first of all, so you know what a sensory deprivation tank is,
yes.
Right? It's, so you person put in a heavily saline, so they float, and no sound, completely dark. So the only thing you have is your own consciousness, no senses. So according to Hoffman, if he's put in a sensory deprivation tank, so all there is consciousness, he doesn't sense anything, he should be willing to be put in a tank that's on wheels and pushed slowly, so he doesn't sense any acceleration, so slowly, just below the threshold of feeling it, onto a major highway where trucks are speeding at 80 miles per hour. According to his view, nothing will happen to him.
That is illogical. Know if that's fair to him. I don't think he's saying.
He says there is no reality. He says it many times.
Does he say there's no reality?
Absolutely.
I hear him saying that. I mean, on one hand, the
reality is consciousness. There's no external reality outside of consciousness. Your consciousness creates the reality.
I think he's making the something similar, analogous to the philosophical point that we relate to reality via an interface.
No, that's not. Yeah, you need to go back to his videos and see the
I'll have to look.
He clearly says when my consciousness is not focused on something, that thing does not exist anymore. I mean, he says that word for word.
Well, if he says then you're. I love your thought experiment, though. The sensory deprivation tank in the middle of the highway. That's great.
Well, and the other thing against the interface, it's a little less esoteric, but why do we have 5 senses? Why not? If it's simply an interface, all we need is 1. And the reason we have 5 is because our senses don't give us simply an interface. We could say it's partly that, but it's not just that. What our senses give us is a model of reality. Now, models are always imperfect.
Yes.
Models are never a reflection of the entire. It's impossible because of combinatorial explosion, blah blah. Vervaeke stuff. Absolutely valid. It is impossible for us to perceive all of reality. Or what we do is perceive what's been selected by evolution to be the pertinent, the relevant facts.
Right. The relevant facts
apply to our ability to survive in the world.
Yes. Imperfectly, but yes.
So what our senses are is a way to build in our brains a model of our world. And the reason we have 5 rather than just 1, which would be the only thing we need, if it's just an interface, we just need 1. But we have 5 because since each model built by each sense is full of imperfections, the cross-referencing of multiple senses
is preferred.
Makes it so that you get closer and closer to a better model of reality. Again, never 100% accurate, never foolproof, but it's pretty darn good. I mean, it's definitely good enough that most of us can live a life without too many accidents and mistaking. We do have the occasional mistaking this for that, and we thought we saw this, but it was really something else. Nothing is foolproof, but so the multiple senses thing to me makes sense in a view where the senses are building a model in our brain, an abstract model of the world. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense when viewed as a simple interface and nothing else.
Okay. I won't judge between you and Hoffman, but I think you're correct. I don't know if Hoffman is saying there's no new reality on the other side of the interface.
Yeah.
But I like your argument. It's a good one.
I must admit that Hoffman sometimes seems to be, he's a little bit ambiguous, but I've seen him say in talks, and again, I don't know if it's like his latest current view, but in previous, so sometimes it goes back to a couple of years back, say, there is no reality, there is no reality. And as a matter of fact, it's one of the things he claims is he basically challenges, and another bizarre claim that he makes is space-time is not real, right? I mean, have you heard any of his thoughts where he actually comes out and says that?
No.
The space-time, like in the Einsteinian sense, space-time, 3 dimensions plus time.
Yeah.
And he says, no, it's not real. It's complete illusion. And he says we've evolved, to an interface between consciousnesses, but space-time is it's not real. It's just an interface. Say, well, how can you talk about evolution and deny that time is real. I mean, evolution, within the term evolution, built into it is the notion of time.
Yeah.
Something evolves over time.
Yeah.
So again, there's a lot of just things that just don't make sense. I'll give you time. You can get back to me.
Yeah.
And in a future video, you can say, well, Karl was completely wrong about Hoffman, and Hoffman says something completely different. It's up to you. But right now, let's just say I'm not impressed, but okay.
Okay. Well, you've given me tons of stuff to chew on, Karl. You've colonized.
There's more.
Well, I'm sure there is.
I could go on,
so
but I don't want to waste. Right. I don't.
We will have to follow it. We will have to do this again, because I have found this very, very helpful in a lot of areas. You've really brought me a bunch of really good ideas and really good ways of approaching and some good resources. So Taleb has been on my radar, and Kahneman, but there's since I started my YouTube channel, everything's been on my radar, and it's
you have an unbelievable amount of output, and I just don't know how you do it, but because you're a full-time pastor. But
all those people,
but if you have the time, it's well worth it. But you should go in the order that he published his books.
Who? Taleb?
Taleb, yeah. There's 4 books. He calls the total. He calls it the inserto, for uncertainty. But the first one was Fooled by Randomness, which I read like 15 years ago, something like that. Maybe more now. It's almost 20 years that time. Maybe not quite. But anyway, and then the second was The Black Swan. Then the third one was Anti-Fragile, which brings up a concept which is absolutely invaluable, the concept of anti-fragility. I mean, he had to come up with that word, anti-fragile, to explain what he meant.
Yeah.
So how systems that gain from randomness and fluctuation. And then the latest one is Skin in the Game. So that was published about 2 years ago.
Are they for lay persons? Are they technical?
No, not technical.
Okay.
He typically puts the technical part in appendices at the end of the book. So if you do want to go into technical stuff, he also has a bunch of stuff online on YouTube. He has some courses on probabilities and statistics. Some of it is very technical. I don't even even with my scientific background, it's hard for me to follow. I mean, I was not a statistician but there are some concepts that he exposed me to, like kurtosis and things like that, and the different types of distribution, like fat-tailed distributions. I had no idea what a fat-tailed distribution was until I read Taleb, but now I understand it. I understand exactly why he brings this up. It's very, very important to understand the world. If you want to understand how the world works, you need to know about fat-tailed distributions and why they are different than thin-tailed distributions and why people get confused. But anyway, Taleb to me is a must-read. It's if you get the time, please do. I mean, that's my recommendation. And I would read him as opposed to watching videos of him on YouTube and stuff like that. I don't know, he's not the best speaker. Well, English is probably like his 4th language anyway, but he speaks very good English. But so yeah, it's like English is my 2nd language, French being my 1st. And but he speaks like Arabic, French, because he's from Lebanon, so he spoke French as English, and then a couple of others I can't remember. But he's very, very well-earned person. Just unfortunately very abrasive.
Yeah, well, I've heard. The reputation goes before.
He calls Sam Harris and Pinker entertainers. So that's
well, when you come out here to California, because you very much fit into our meetup crowd here in Sacramento, because we got all these people who are low in agreeableness, and whenever they hear an idea, it's like, I'm going to prove that thing wrong. And so you are very much the temperamental type that we have in our meetup. So when you come out here, we'll figure that out via email. We'll figure out a date, and I very much want to see you in the mix of a meetup. And I think a bunch of my meetup people are going to watch this video, and they're going to say, I want to talk to this Karl because he said some things that I disagree with, and I want to be there for that.
But that's great. That's what I like. We always need the feedback. We always think better when we get the feedback, and as long as it's constructive. So that's the thing.
Absolutely.
But But yeah, so the race is 7 June, I think Sunday, and obviously that weekend I won't be available, but either before or after. So
Okay.
I'll be staying in the area, in the Bay Area, for probably at least 3 weeks. So
Okay. Well, we'll
I should
figure
have
it out,
plenty
and
of-
we'll
should have
make
plenty of
sure
time.
it happens. So
Right, that would be great.
okay, Karl.
That would be like, I would definitely make my year. You know.
Oh no, we'll have fun. Trust me, we'll have
I
a good
know.
time. This will be a very good time. So
I mean, just this talk already was fantastic. I just love it. I just love your style. I love the way. I love everything about your channel. So.
Well, thank you. Okay, Karl, we will end it for now, and we will talk again. Probably it's only January. We'll talk again before June, I'm sure.
Yeah, we've got plenty of time to see you. I get plenty of training
That's
on my schedule too in these things.
All right.
Okay.
Take care, Karl.
Bye.
Bye-bye.